The rain came sideways that night outside Reno. Not the soft kind, not the kind that taps on glass and makes people feel poetic about their lives. This was Nevada winter rain, sharp and metallic and almost frozen, the kind that cuts through denim and bites into bone before you even realize you're wet. It hammered the tin roof of the Silver Dust Diner like 1,000 angry fists, and beneath the one working floodlight in the parking lot, 7 Harley Davidsons sat in a crooked row, their chrome dull under the storm, their engines still ticking with leftover heat, cooling down, settling. The way old wolves settle after a long run, not sleeping, just waiting. Inside the back booth belonged to the Iron Revenants. It always did. Every waitress who had ever worked a Friday night at the Silver Dust knew the rules without being told. You don't sit near that booth. You don't stare. You bring the coffee black, the food hot, and you keep your distance unless someone waves you over. Not because they were cruel, not because they screamed or broke things, but because the silence those men carried was heavier than any threat. It filled the room the way smoke fills a closed garage. Slow, thick, impossible to ignore. There were 7 of them tonight. Colt Harlan sat at the center, his back against the wall, the way it had been every night for 23 years since he came home from a war the government had already started forgetting before the last boots left the sand. He was 51 now. Silver threaded through his beard like wire through old leather. Burn scars crawled up the left side of his neck and disappeared beneath a collar he never unbuttoned, not even in summer. His hands were enormous, a mechanic's hands, a fighter's hands, wrapped around a coffee mug that looked like a toy in his grip. He hadn't spoken in 40 minutes. Nobody pushed him. Nobody ever did. To his left, Rex Dallow filled the booth like a piece of industrial machinery that someone had accidentally dressed in leather. 6'4" and 260 pounds, with a shaved head and a voice that sounded like gravel being poured into a steel drum. Road captain for 11 years. He had done time. 4 years in a Nevada state facility for aggravated assault after a bar fight that left 2 men in the hospital and Rex with a fractured orbital socket he never got properly fixed. His left eye still drooped slightly, giving him a permanent expression of sleepy menace that had unsettled better men than most people would ever meet. He was eating a steak without cutting it, tearing pieces off with his fork like the meat had personally offended him. Across the table sat Mace Tellers. Thin, quiet, the kind of quiet that made people nervous because it wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. Mace had been a combat medic before the club. 2 tours in places that didn't make the evening news anymore. He came back with steady hands and a mind that replayed things at 3 in the morning that no amount of whiskey could drown. He read books. Real books. Thick ones, dog-eared paperbacks he carried in the inside pocket of his cut. He rarely looked anyone in the eye for longer than 3 seconds. Not out of weakness. Out of something else. Something he kept locked behind a door that had no handle on the outside. The rest of the table was filled with men whose stories could each fill a novel nobody would believe. Birch Pruitt, the club mechanic, a former high school shop teacher who had lost his wife to a drunk driver on a Tuesday afternoon 14 years ago, and his teaching license to the bottle that followed. He had rebuilt himself one engine at a time until the engines became the only thing that felt honest. Sloan Briggs, the sergeant-at-arms who walked with a limp from a motorcycle wreck in 2014 that killed his riding partner and left him with a titanium rod in his left femur and a guilt so deep it had become structural load-bearing part of the architecture of who he was. Dutch and Riggs, broken in their own particular ways, still breathing, still riding, still showing up for each other when the rest of the world had long since stopped showing up for them. That was what the Iron Revenants were. Not a gang, not a costume party for middle-aged men playing tough. They were the last wall, the final line of men who had nowhere else to go and no one else to be. And somewhere in that wreckage, they had built something that functioned however roughly as a family. The coffee was bad, the jukebox was broken, the rain wasn't stopping, and then the bell above the front door rang. Every head in the diner turned, not fast, slow, the way predators track movement without committing to it. Waitresses, truckers, the cook leaning through the kitchen window with a cigarette behind his ear. Everyone looked. A girl stood in the doorway. Small, thin, soaking wet. A hoodie 3 sizes too big hung off her shoulders like a collapsed tent. The fabric so waterlogged it dripped a steady stream onto the cracked tile floor. Her sneakers were held together with duct tape. Her jeans were torn at both knees. Not fashion torn, survival torn. The kind of damage that comes from falling on asphalt and getting back up because stopping wasn't an option. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, or not just from cold. Her knuckles were bruised, the right hand worse than the left, swollen around the middle finger, the way a joint swells when someone has bent it backward or grabbed it hard enough to grind bone against bone. Her eyes swept the room with the kind of awareness no child should possess. Not curiosity. Assessment. She was reading exits, counting bodies, measuring threats. She had done this before, walked into rooms full of strangers and calculated her odds. That fact alone should break your heart. But the night was just getting started. The girl's gaze moved across the diner with the precision of a compass needle finding north. It passed over the truckers, the waitresses, the cook. It landed on the back booth, on the leather, on the patches, on Colt Harlan specifically, though she had never seen him before in her life. And she walked straight toward him, not running, not hesitating, weaving between tables with a directness that made the truckers shift in their seats and made Rex Dallow slowly set down his fork. She stopped 2 feet from the table. Nobody spoke. The rain hammered the roof. The fluorescent light above the booth buzzed and flickered. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pan clattered against a sink. The girl raised one trembling hand and pointed at Colt's right forearm, where a tattoo of a raven in flight spread its wings across scarred skin, the feathers dissolving into smoke at the edges. My dad had that same mark. Her voice was small, but it didn't waver. It was the voice of someone who had practiced being brave so many times it almost sounded real. Colt didn't move. His eyes dropped to the tattoo, then back to the girl. Rex's hand had drifted beneath the table, not toward a weapon, just instinct. The reflex of a man who had learned that surprises in diners rarely ended well. Mace closed his book slowly, one finger keeping the page. His medic's eyes had already begun scanning the child. The bruised knuckles, the way she held her right hand slightly curled, the shallow irregularity of her breathing that had nothing to do with the cold. "Who's your dad, kid?" Rex's voice came out low in careful thunder from a long way off. The girl reached into the front pocket of her hoodie. She pulled out a photograph. It was crumpled and water-stained, folded so many times the creases had turned white. She unfolded it with careful fingers and placed it flat on the table between the coffee mugs and the ashtray. The photo showed a young man in his mid-20s, lean, dark-haired, sitting on a Harley Softail with the same raven tattoo visible on his forearm. Behind him, a clubhouse wall displayed the Iron Revenant's patch. He was laughing, genuinely laughing, the kind that crinkles the eyes and lifts the whole face, the kind of laugh that men like these had stopped wearing years ago, as though joy were something the road gradually stripped away, mile by mile, until only the riding remained. Colt picked up the photograph. His face didn't change. That was the terrifying part. His expression remained exactly the same. Stone, granite, nothing. But his hand trembled just once. A single vibration that traveled through his fingers and into the photograph before he locked it down with the iron discipline of a man who had spent decades refusing to feel things in front of other people. Eli Voss. The name came from Mace, barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that booth, it landed like a stone, dropped into still water, and the ripple moved through every man at the table simultaneously. The name hadn't been spoken here in 14 years. Not since 2010, when Eli Voss had ridden out one autumn night with a duffel bag strapped to his handlebars and a woman named Nora waiting in a car at the edge of town. He had broken no oath. The Iron Revenants weren't that kind of club. He had simply disappeared the way a star disappears at dawn. Still there technically, just invisible. They had talked about him for a while afterward. Then they stopped. Eli became a silence, a gap at the table, a name nobody brought up because bringing it up meant acknowledging that leaving was possible, that the road wasn't enough, that somewhere out there, a brother had found something better than this. And now his daughter was standing in their diner, soaking wet, bruised, and 9 years old. "What's your name?" Colt asked. His voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of a man choosing each word with the care of someone who understood that the wrong tone could detonate something fragile and irreplaceable. "Ivy. Ivy Voss." "Where's your mother, Ivy?" The girl's composure cracked. Not much, just a fracture. A hairline split in the armor she had built around herself sometime between learning to walk and learning that the world did not reliably protect small things. Her lower lip trembled for half a second before she bit down on it hard enough to leave a mark. "She's sick, real sick. She can't get out of bed anymore. And the man who owns our place keeps coming. And she told me to hide, but I didn't want to hide anymore." The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like they had been held behind a dam for months, and the dam had finally found its breaking point. Ivy's hands clenched at her sides. Her bruised knuckles went white. "My dad left me a letter before he died." She paused, swallowed hard, and then she recited from memory with the precision of someone who had read those words 1,000 times in the dark, alone in rooms that were too cold and too quiet. He said, "If life ever turns dark, find my brothers. They'll come. They always come." Silence, not the comfortable kind. The kind that presses against your chest. The kind that makes strong men look at their hands because looking at each other would mean admitting something none of them were ready to say out loud. Eli Voss was dead. Their brother was dead, and none of them had known. He had been gone from this world for 4 years, and the silence they had been sitting in the companionable quiet of men who had run out of words for the road had contained that fact without anyone knowing it. And now his 9-year-old daughter was standing in front of them with bruised hands and duct-tape shoes, carrying the last thing her father had given her. Not money, not a name, not an address, just a belief. A belief that these scarred and broken men would show up when she needed them to. Colt set the photograph down on the table with the gentleness of a man handling something sacred. He looked at Ivy, really looked at her, past the wet hoodie and the bruised knuckles and the survival-torn jeans, and he saw Eli, the same stubborn jaw, the same dark eyes that burned even when the body was exhausted, the same defiance that said, "I will not break. Not here, not in front of you, not tonight." "Rex." Colt's voice was quiet. "Yeah, get her something warm to eat." Rex was already moving. Mace had moved without anyone noticing. He was crouching beside Ivy now with his medic's eyes cataloging everything his hands hadn't touched yet. The pallor beneath the wet skin, the way she favored her right side, the loaded stillness of a child who has learned that sudden movements invite consequences. "Hey, Ivy, I'm going to look at your hand. Okay, I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to make sure nothing's broken." Ivy studied him for 3 full seconds. An eternity in child years. She was measuring him the way she had measured the room when she walked in, looking for the lie, the angle, the moment the kindness would curdle into something with a price attached. Then she extended her hand slowly, the way a stray animal extends trust towards someone holding food. Not because it believes, because it has run out of other options. Mace's fingers were gentle, impossibly gentle for hands that had worked on men bleeding out in the dark. He manipulated each joint with clinical precision, watching Ivy's face for the flinch she was trying not to show. "It's not broken," he said, "but someone grabbed you hard, twisted." He looked up at her. "Who did this?" Ivy pulled her hand back. "Nobody." Mace didn't push. He had heard that word before in exactly that tone. From soldiers who limped into medical tents with wounds they were ashamed of. From grown men who would rather bleed quietly than admit someone had gotten to them. He recognized the architecture of that particular silence, and he knew that pushing against it only made the walls thicker. Rex came back with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, a glass of orange juice, and a chocolate milkshake he had apparently convinced the cook to make, despite the machine being technically out of service. He set it all down in front of Ivy with hands that could bend rebar and said simply, "Eat. Don't argue." Ivy ate fast, hunched over the plate, one arm curled protectively around the food. The way children eat when they have learned that meals can disappear without warning. Every man at that table recognized the posture. Some of them had eaten the same way in group homes or military mess halls or correctional facility cafeterias where hesitation meant going hungry. They said nothing. They watched without watching. And the silence around the booth became something different. Not the loaded silence from before. Something older. Something that functioned like a roof over a person who had been standing in the rain too long. While she ate, Colt made 3 phone calls from the payphone near the restrooms. His voice was low. His words were few. He came back and sat down and watched Ivy finish the milkshake, scraping the bottom of the glass with the straw until it made that hollow rattling sound that means a person got every last drop of something good. "Carson City," he said to the table. "Trailer park off Route 50. Place called Desert Pines." "I know it," Sloan said. His voice carried the flat weight of a man who had driven past that park many times and registered exactly what kind of place it was. Bad pipes, no upkeep, landlord-run slumlord operations across 3 counties. Man named Del Rourke. There have been assault complaints. Nothing ever stuck because his tenants are either too scared or too sick to follow through. "Nora Voss is in Unit 14, Colt continued. "Advanced lung disease. She's on oxygen full-time. No insurance. No family close by. The eviction notices go back 4 months. Rex leaned back and the booth creaked under his weight. "How did the kid get here? Carson City is 40 miles. Everyone looked at Ivy. She had stopped eating. She sat very still with the stillness of someone who has been surrounded before and knows the difference between being cornered and being seen. She wasn't afraid of these men. She was afraid of the question, because the answer revealed something about how far she had been pushed and how little the world had bothered to notice. "I walked some," she said. "Got a ride from a truck driver for part of it. He was nice. He bought me a sandwich." She paused. "I've been looking for 3 days." 3 days. A 9-year-old girl had spent 3 days traveling 40 miles through Nevada, winter sleeping where she could find shelter, eating what strangers offered, guided by nothing but a dead man's letter and a photograph of a raven tattoo. Because every system designed to protect children had failed her so completely that a room full of outlaw bikers was her last resort. Let that settle for a moment. Let it sit in your chest the way it sat in theirs. Colt stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate, the way tectonic plates shift before an earthquake. He pulled a 20 from his wallet and dropped it on the table for the food. Then he looked at his brothers one by one, eye to eye, the way a man looks at the people he is about to ask something of that cannot be asked with words. No one spoke. No one needed to. Rex was already reaching for his helmet. Mace folded his book and slid it into his cut. Birch cracked his knuckles with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man preparing for work that needed doing. Sloan stood with the careful mechanical precision of someone whose body was partly titanium and who had long since stopped complaining about the weather in his bones. Dutch and Riggs rose without discussion. Colt crouched down to Ivy's level. His knees popped. His burn scars disappeared into shadow. Up close, his eyes were gray. Not cold gray, not steel gray. Storm gray. The color of Nevada skies that haven't decided yet. "We're gonna go see your mom. You okay to ride?" Ivy looked at him. Looked at the men standing behind him, pulling on gloves, zipping jackets, transforming from tired men at a diner table into something more organized, more purposeful, more present. She looked at the raven on his forearm one more time. "He said you'd come," she whispered. Colt didn't answer. He shrugged off his leather jacket, the one with decades of road grime and memory soaked into every fiber, and wrapped it around Ivy's shoulders. It swallowed her completely. She disappeared inside it the way a small animal disappears into a den. And for the first time since she had walked through that door, she stopped shaking. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet. The parking lot was a sheet of black ice under flickering neon. Colt lifted Ivy onto the back of his Road King and showed her where to hold on, and she gripped the back of his vest with both hands, including the bruised one, pain be damned, and pressed her face against the leather between his shoulder blades. 7 engines fired in sequence. The sound rolled across the parking lot like approaching thunder, low and deep and primordial. The kind of sound that vibrates in your sternum before it reaches your ears. Headlights cut through the sleet, exhaust mixed with frozen air. They rode east toward Carson City in a tight formation. Colt at the front, with Ivy pressed against his back, Rex flanking left, Mace flanking right, the rest falling in behind, like a convoy, like a wall, like something ancient and unbreakable moving through the storm. The Silver Dust Diner grew small in their mirrors, then vanished into the dark. 40 miles of frozen highway stretched ahead, and at the end of it, a dying woman waited in a trailer. She couldn't leave with an eviction notice on her door, and a landlord who came too close at night, and no idea that the sound approaching through the winter was the sound of her dead husband's brothers coming to honor a debt that had no price. The ride took just under an hour. Nobody spoke. Communication happened the way it always did on the road between men who had ridden together long enough to think in formation. Hand signals, headlight flashes, the subtle language of bodies and machines in motion. Ivy didn't move, didn't squirm, didn't complain about the cold or the speed or the sleet that stung any exposed skin. She held on with the grim determination of someone who understood, even at 9 years old, that this ride was the hinge on which everything would turn. Desert Pines Trailer Park announced itself with a crooked sign, half its letters burned out, leaning at an angle that suggested the next strong wind would finish the job. The entrance was a mud track bordered by dead chain link fence and overflowing dumpsters. The streetlights that still worked cast orange circles that made the puddles look like something that had been spilled and never cleaned up. The trailer sat in rows, most of them dark, a few showing the blue flicker of television screens behind curtain windows. The smell hit even through their helmets. Sewage and wet rot, and the chemical tang of poverty compressing itself into the smallest possible space. Unit 14 was at the far end of the last row, backed against a concrete drainage ditch that had overflowed into brown mud. The trailer was a single wide from the early 80s rust, eating through the aluminum siding in long orange stripes. The front steps were a stack of cinder blocks that shifted when you stepped on them. A piece of plywood covered what had once been a window. The door was held shut with a bungee cord because the lock had been broken and never fixed. Colt killed his engine. The others followed. The sudden silence was enormous. Ivy climbed down from the bike without being helped. She walked to the door without hesitation, unhooked the bungee cord, and pulled it open against its warped frame with both hands. She stepped inside. The men followed. Nora Voss was lying on a mattress on the floor in the back room of the trailer. No bed frame, no fitted sheet, just a thin sleeping bag unzipped and spread flat, and 2 blankets that had been washed so many times they were nearly transparent. An oxygen concentrator hummed beside her, its green indicator light the only color in the room. The tubing ran to a nasal cannula, sitting crookedly across her face, taped in place because the original clip had broken. She was 38 years old. She looked 60. Her skin was the color of old paper, her collarbones pressed against her shirt like something trying to escape. Her breathing was shallow and wet, each inhale accompanied by a crackling sound that made Mace's hands involuntarily close into fists, because he had heard that sound before in field hospitals, and it never came attached to good news. The trailer was cold, not cool, cold. The heating unit was broken, and the only warmth came from a space heater plugged into an extension cord that ran through a crack in the wall to a neighbor's outlet. Condensation frosted the inside of the windows. The breath of the men who had just walked in clouded and dissolved in the frigid air. On the kitchen counter, bills were stacked in a pile, held down by an empty coffee mug. Medical bills, utility bills, eviction notices on yellow paper with red stamps reading final warning. Beside them, prescription bottles, some empty, some with expiration dates from the previous year. None of them recently refilled. This was what falling through every crack at once looked like. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just cold and quiet and slow and invisible to everyone who didn't stand in the middle of it. Nora's eyes opened when the boots came through the door. She didn't startle. She was past startling. But her gaze went immediately to Ivy the way a mother's gaze always goes first to the one thing in the world she cannot afford to lose. "Baby," she whispered. "Where did you?" Then she saw the men. 7 bikers filling the narrow hallway of her trailer. Leather and road dirt and the smell of cold engines and the particular gravity of men who have been through too much to pretend otherwise. Their patches, their scars, their silence. They looked like something from a fever dream. Too large for this space, too solid for this reality, too present in a life that had been nothing but absence for years. Nora's hand found the edge of her sleeping bag. "Ivy, come here." "Mom, it's okay." But Ivy didn't move. She stood between her mother and the men with her feet planted and her chin up. And in that moment, she looked so completely like Eli Voss that Colt had to look away for a half second to hold himself together. "Ma'am." Colt stepped forward, slowly, palms visible, voice as quiet as he could make it. "My name is Colt Harlan. I rode with your husband. Eli was my brother." Nora stared at him. Her eyes were brown, warm once probably before everything warm had been leached out by worry and sickness and the relentless arithmetic of a life that kept subtracting. Now they were the brown of winter leaves, dry and brittle and waiting. "Eli is dead," she said. "Not cruel, just factual. The way you state something that has been true long enough to lose its ability to wound you in public. I know, your daughter told us. I'm sorry we didn't know sooner. What do you want?" Colt crouched down beside the mattress. His knees hit the cold floor. Up close, he could see the effort each breath cost her. The subtle flare of her nostrils. The small, desperate increments of her chest. The machine beside her working overtime to push oxygen into lungs that were losing the war. "Eli saved my life twice," he said. "Once in a bar fight in Tonopah, when 3 men came at me, and he put himself between me and all 3 of them before I even saw them coming. And once on Highway 93, when my front tire blew at 70 miles an hour, and he pulled alongside me at speed and steadied my handlebar with his hand until I could get stopped." He paused. "I owe him 2 lives. I figure I'll start with yours." Nora searched his face for the lie, for the catch, for the price tag that experience had taught her always came attached to help, because nothing in her world had ever been free. Not the medical care, not the housing, not the sympathy of caseworkers who wrote notes in folders and never came back. "We don't have any money," she said. "I didn't ask for money." "Then what do you want?" Colt held her gaze for a long moment. Rain drummed the trailer roof. The oxygen concentrator hummed. Ivy stood in the doorway with his leather jacket still wrapped around her, like armor she had borrowed and didn't know how to return. "I want you to let us help," he said. "That's it. That's all." Nora's eyes filled. She didn't blink. She didn't wipe them. She let the tears roll down her temples and into the flat pillow beneath her head, in the silence of a woman who had held herself together alone for so long that the sudden possibility of not being alone felt more terrifying than the isolation ever had. Mace was already moving. Without being asked, without waiting for permission, he was pulling the pulse oximeter from his cut pocket and crouching beside the mattress. Checking Nora's oxygen saturation, listening to her breathing, scanning the prescription bottles on the counter with the quiet efficiency of a man reading a situation for damage. "Her O2 sat is in the low 80s, he said to Colt, his voice low. "Bilateral crackles worse on the left. Half these medications are expired and the other half she's been rationing. She needs a hospital." Rex had moved to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator. The interior light had burned out, but he could see the contents well enough by the light coming through the doorway. a half-empty bottle of ketchup, 3 slices of white bread in a plastic bag, a container of yogurt 2 weeks past its date. He closed the door with the careful precision of a man trying very hard not to put his fist through it. Colt. Rex's voice was controlled, but his neck had gone red, the flush climbing from his collar toward his ears, the way it always did when his anger hit the edge of what violence couldn't solve. There's nothing in this house. Colt looked at Ivy. She didn't flinch. She looked back at him with those dark Eli Voss eyes and said 6 words that described an entire architecture of survival built by a child who had no other materials available. I eat at school. Free lunch. 6 words. And every man in that trailer went somewhere private and difficult for exactly 1 second before pulling himself back to the room and the work in front of him. Then from outside somewhere in the dark trailer park, a door slammed. Heavy footsteps on gravel. A man's voice, loud and thick with alcohol, carrying the cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed in a small world where being the biggest presence on the block passed for power. Unit 14, I see those bikes. You got people in there, Nora. You know the rules. No visitors after 10. You're already 4 months behind. And I swear to God, Del Rourke. The landlord stopped at the edge of the motorcycles. 7 Harleys parked in a wall between the mud road and Unit 14. He was a big man, not Rex big, but thick through the middle. The body of someone who had been strong once and had let it go to something softer while continuing to trade on the memory of muscle. Red face, wet flannel shirt, work boots caked with mud. He carried a flashlight like a weapon held at shoulder height, the beam cutting through the sleet. He swept the light across the bikes, across the saddlebag patches, across the boots visible through the trailer's open door. Then Colt stepped out. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. He simply appeared in the doorway and came down the cinder block steps one at a time, his boots finding each surface with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world and every reason to use it carefully. Behind him, Rex filled the doorframe, then Sloan, then Birch. Del Rourke's flashlight beam found Colt's face and stopped. Whatever Rourke had expected to find in Unit 14 at 11 o'clock on a frozen Wednesday night, it was not this. Not men built from scar tissue and road miles standing in the sleet without flinching, looking at him the way a wall looks at a fist that is about to learn something permanent about concrete. "This your property?" Colt asked. Rourke adjusted his grip on the flashlight. Yeah, it's my property, and that woman owes me 4 months' rent, and she's in violation of her lease with unauthorized. How much? What the 4 months? How much? Rourke blinked. Rain ran down his face. His eyes moved from Colt to Rex to the row of motorcycles and back again, doing a calculation that had nothing to do with arithmetic and everything to do with the sudden realization that the power he was accustomed to exercising in this trailer park had shifted so fundamentally in the last 30 seconds that his usual tools were useless. 2,400, he said. Colt reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a fold of bills, counted out $2,400 in the rain, and held it out. Rourke took it, counted it again, looked up. "We clear?" Colt asked. "For now, but the lease says." "We clear." The second time it wasn't a question. Rourke opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Rex, who offered him a smile. Not a warm smile, not even a threatening one. Just the smile of a man who had done 4 years in a state facility and found the entire civilian concept of intimidation genuinely charming in its ambition. The landlord retreated into the dark. His footsteps faded across the gravel. A door slammed somewhere down the row. Colt stood in the sleet for a long moment after Rourke was gone. He stared at the space where the man had been. Then he turned and walked back inside. Ivy was standing beside the window. She had seen the whole thing. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, with something she didn't have a precise word for yet. The recognition that there are men in this world who stand between the dark and the people who cannot stand in it alone. The recognition that her father had known such men and had trusted them with the most important thing he possessed. Inside, Colt made the additional calls and arrangements that the night required. Mace adjusted Nora's oxygen flow and stayed close monitoring. Rex found an extra blanket in the hall closet and spread it over Nora without asking. Birch checked the space heater, determined it was running at its maximum safe output, and moved it 3 inches closer to the mattress without making a production of it. And outside in the dark of the trailer park, a door opened quietly 3 units down. Del Rourke stood in his doorway with a phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, but the night was cold and still, and voices carry in cold air, and Ivy was standing beside the window with her ear near the gap where the plywood didn't quite meet the frame. She heard every word. Call Strent. I want those bikes gone by morning. Ivy went still. The name meant nothing to her, but the tone meant everything. She had spent her entire short life learning to read the difference between a man making an ordinary call and a man making a call that changes something. Del Rourke was making the second kind. She stepped back from the window. Her eyes found Colt across the room. He was already watching the window. Outside, the orange ember of a cigarette Colt had lit glowed in the sleet. He had been standing in the cold without quite knowing why, the way a man stands at the edge of something when some part of him understands, before the rest does, that the ground ahead is different from the ground behind. He had heard Rourke's voice carry across the lot, had caught the name inside it. One syllable. Enough. Cal Strent. Colt stood with the cigarette burning down between his fingers and the sleet coming steady against his face, and the name sitting in his chest like a coal that had never gone entirely cold. Not since 2009. Not since a warehouse south of Sparks and a duffel bag and $20,000 and a handshake with a man whose smile never reached his eyes. He had told himself for 15 years that it was gray money, business done in the space between legal and otherwise, where men like him conducted the commerce of survival. He had told himself he hadn't known, hadn't asked, hadn't needed to. He had told himself a lot of things in 15 years. The cigarette burned to the filter. He hadn't noticed. He dropped it into the mud and crushed it with his boot, turned back toward the trailer door, went inside. He said nothing about the name he had heard. Not yet. There was a woman barely breathing on the floor of a trailer, and a 9-year-old girl watching him with her father's eyes, and a room full of men who trusted him to lead before he asked them to follow. The name would keep until morning, but the night, as Colt Harlan already knew, had other plans. It was past midnight when Mace appeared at the trailer door with the kind of expression that belongs to a man who has assessed a situation and found it worse than the original estimate. She needs to be moved, he said quietly. Not tomorrow, tonight. Colt looked at him. If her O2 drops below 80 while we're sitting here watching, the nearest hospital is 40 minutes away, and this trailer has no phone. The concentrator she's using is consumer grade. It's working, but it's not going to hold indefinitely at this temperature. Colt looked at the mattress on the floor, at Nora's closed eyes, at Ivy sitting cross-legged beside her mother with both hands resting lightly on her mother's wrist, the way a child rests a hand on something they are afraid of losing. He made the call. He stepped outside and used his cell phone and woke up Dutch with 4 words, and Dutch understood what those 4 words meant and said he would be there by 6. When Colt came back in, Ivy was looking at him. She always seemed to be looking at him, not with need exactly, with the careful measurement of someone watching a new bridge before trusting it with weight. He had the uncomfortable sense that she was doing math in her head, running the calculation that children who have been failed too many times run automatically on every adult who enters their field of concern. He crouched down beside her. His knees hit the cold floor for the second time that night. We're going to move you both to somewhere safer in the morning, somewhere warm, with proper equipment for your mom. Ivy looked at her mother, looked back at him. She won't want to go, Ivy said. She's scared they'll use it against her. The county, she said, if things look worse than they already look, they'll take me. Colt held her gaze. He didn't flinch from what she'd said. He didn't rush to reassure her with words that would sound hollow to a child who had learned to measure reassurance against outcomes. We'll handle it, he said. Ivy studied him for a long moment. Then she lay down beside her mother on the thin mattress on the cold floor and closed her eyes. But she did not sleep. Colt could tell by her breathing. Some part of her was still listening, still measuring, still running the numbers on a world that had not yet earned her trust. Outside, the sleet had slackened to a cold mist. Colt and Rex stood between the motorcycles at the edge of the trailer lot, their breath clouding in the still air, looking at the darkness at the far end of the park, where Del Rourke's unit sat quiet behind its closed door. "This is bigger than a rent check," Rex said. "I know." Rourke called someone named Strent. Colt said nothing. Rex looked at him. The drooping left eye, the prison tattoos, the big hands open at his sides. He had ridden with Colt for 11 years, and in that time he had learned to read the particular quality of Colt's silences the way a navigator reads weather. This one had density to it, the density of something already known. "You know that name," Rex said. It wasn't a question. Colt exhaled. His breath dissolved in the mist. "Yeah," he said. "I know that name." Rex waited. When Colt said nothing more, Rex looked away and looked back and looked away again, doing the calculation of a man who has followed someone through enough bad weather to know the difference between a leader who doesn't have all the information yet and a leader who has more of it than he's sharing. He let it go. For now. There was a sick woman in a trailer who needed morning to come, and a child who needed to sleep, and 40 miles of frozen highway between here and a place that might qualify as safe. The conversation about Cal Strent would keep. But when they went back inside and Colt stood in the narrow hallway of Unit 14 with his back against the wall and his eyes on the room, Rex Dallow watched the side of the man's face in the dim light of the space heater and saw something there he hadn't seen in years. Something that lived behind the stone expression and the controlled breathing and the decades of practiced stillness. Something that looked like a man who already knew the past was not as buried as he'd told himself. And somewhere across the trailer park, in a unit with the lights off and the phone still warm from the call he had just made, Del Rourke was waiting for a man named Strent to answer. The van arrived at 5:40 in the morning. Dutch drove it in without headlights for the last 100 yards, navigating the mud track of desert pines by memory and the faint gray suggestion of dawn pressing against the eastern mountains. He had stripped the rear seats and laid down moving blankets across the floor, and he had brought the portable oxygen concentrator from the clubhouse storage room, the one they had kept for Riggs's mother before she passed the previous spring. It was older than the unit beside Nora's mattress, but it ran cleaner, and Mace had already checked it twice by phone before Dutch left. Moving Nora was like moving water in cupped hands. Careful, slow, the constant fear that any wrong angle would spill what little was left. Mace monitored her oxygen the entire time, 2 fingers on her pulse counting respirations, watching the color of her nail beds, with the focus of a man performing surgery without instruments in a theater with bad lighting. Rex lifted her from the mattress with an enormous and careful gentleness, the kind that large men sometimes discover in themselves when they encounter something genuinely fragile. He carried her to the van as though she weighed nothing, which she nearly didn't. 90-some pounds of a woman who had been slowly disappearing for 2 years, the illness taking her in increments too small to track, until one day you looked and realized that most of what had made her was already gone. Ivy walked ahead and held the van door open, her hands steady on the frame. When Rex passed with Nora in his arms, Ivy reached up without being asked and adjusted the oxygen tubing that had shifted during the lift, her fingers finding the cannula and resetting it against her mother's face, with the practiced efficiency of a child who had been her mother's keeper for longer than anyone should ask of a 9-year-old. Rex looked at her over Nora's shoulder, said nothing. His jaw worked once and then was still. They pulled out of desert pines as the first gray light hit the Sierras. Colt rode in front. The van followed. Rex and Sloan flanked it on either side, their Harleys boxing the vehicle in a formation that was deliberate and would have been recognizable to anyone who had ever seen a military convoy move something valuable through uncertain terrain. As they passed Unit 3, Colt saw Del Rourke standing in his doorway with a coffee mug and a phone watching the convoy leave. The man's expression carried the particular relief of someone who has been given a reprieve he knows he hasn't earned, already calculating how to spend it. Colt held the eye contact for 3 full seconds as he rode past. Didn't nod, didn't slow, just let the look land and stay. The Iron Revenant's clubhouse sat on 12 acres of high desert scrubland 20 minutes north of Reno. It was set back from the highway behind a gravel drive lined with juniper trees that had survived everything Nevada could produce and looked like they had opinions about it. The main building was a converted auto shop, cinder block walls, corrugated tin roof, a garage bay large enough for 20 bikes in a common room that had absorbed the smoke and arguments and silences of nearly 4 decades. It was not beautiful. It had never tried to be. It was shelter in the most fundamental sense. Walls thick enough to keep the cold out and the brothers in. They set Nora up into the back room, the one the club called the chapel, though it had nothing to do with worship. It was simply the quietest space in the building. Real walls instead of partitions. A window that faced east for morning light. A door that latched properly. Mace arranged the oxygen concentrator, checked the connections 3 times, adjusted the flow rate, and hung a clipboard on the wall to track vitals every 4 hours. Ivy stood in the doorway and watched everything with the cataloging intensity of a child memorizing the layout of a space she might need to navigate in the dark. Her eyes moved to the window first, then the door, then the hallway behind her. Not consciously anymore, just the way breathing works. The body doing what it has been trained to do by too many rooms that turn dangerous without warning, Ivy May said quietly. His voice had the particular calibration of a man who had talked frightened people down from a lot of different kinds of ledges. Your mom is stable right now. That means you can breathe too. She didn't answer, but her shoulders dropped a quarter inch, the smallest possible concession to safety. The first 2 days passed in a suspended tension. Brothers came and went. Some Colt had called. Others arrived because the network had registered that something was happening, and they had come the way iron filings come to a magnet drawn by a force they couldn't have named precisely, but didn't need to. Ivy watched them all with the careful wariness of an animal that has been fed by strangers before and understands that kindness and danger can arrive wearing identical faces. She ate when food appeared in front of her. She slept on the floor beside her mother's cot, despite the folding bed Mace had set up. She spoke only to Nora, and even then in whispers. On the third morning, Birch Pruitt found her in the garage. She was standing in front of a partially disassembled shovelhead engine, her hands clasped behind her back, studying the exposed cylinders with the focused attention of someone who was not looking at a machine but reading one. Birch watched her from the doorway for a full minute before she noticed him. That's a 1978, she said, without looking up. Birch blinked. How do you know that? My dad had pictures. He had notebooks, engine diagrams with labels. He used to show me. She paused. Mom burned most of them after he died. She didn't want me to end up on the road. Birch walked over slowly, maintaining 3 feet of distance. Close enough to be present, far enough to not constitute a pressure. He pointed at the cam chest. What's wrong with it? Ivy tilted her head, studied the assembly for a moment with the particular patience of someone who has learned not to answer questions before she is certain. The pushrod tube seal is leaking. You can see the oil stain on the lower fin. Birch stared at her. Then he reached to the workbench, picked up a wrench, and held it out. Show me. The next 3 hours were the quietest the garage had ever been, and somehow also the most alive. Ivy worked with a concentration that bordered on obsessive, her small hands finding angles in the engine that Birch couldn't reach without a specialized tool. Her questions were precise and mechanical, stripped of the emotional weight that crushed everything else in her life. The engine was a problem with rules, rules that did not change based on who held power or who was sick or who decided to leave. A leaking seal was a leaking seal. A worn cam bearing was a worn cam bearing. The diagnosis was honest in a way the world outside this garage had rarely been. When Rex walked through at noon and saw Ivy with grease on her forearm and something approaching peace on her face, he stopped in the doorway and looked at Birch. Birch shook his head once. Don't say anything. Don't ruin it. Rex moved on. It was on the 4th day that Mace found Colt alone in the garage after the others had gone to bed. Colt was sitting on an overturned milk crate in the corner with a cup of cold coffee and the stillness of a man who has not been sitting still at all, but has been moving very fast through a very dark interior space that has no exits he can find. The trouble light swayed on its hook above the workbench. The shadows moved with it. Mace sat down on the stool across from him. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just placed a folded piece of paper on the workbench between them. Yellowed, creased at the edges where moisture had touched it over years. The fold lines were white with age. Colt looked at it. "What is that?" Mace said. "A letter. Eli sent it to me in 2013, 3 years after he left the club." Colt didn't move. "He asked me not to give it to you unless the truth needed to come out." Those were his exact words. "Unless the truth needs to come out. And you decided tonight it needs to come out. I decided tonight that a 9-year-old girl is sleeping on the floor of our chapel because people she doesn't know are the safest option she has left. And if that's true, then whatever Eli was protecting you from by not sending this letter directly, it doesn't get to stay protected anymore." Colt picked up the letter, unfolded it carefully the way you handle something that has been waiting a long time and deserves to arrive intact. Eli's handwriting. He recognized it before he read a word. The sharp forward lean of it, like every letter was in a hurry to get somewhere. He read it once, then again. The garage was very quiet. The trouble light swayed. Outside, the wind moved through the junipers along the drive. Colt set the letter down on the workbench. He placed both palms flat on the cold metal surface. The burn scars on his neck pulled tight the way they always did when his body was processing something that wouldn't fit through ordinary channels. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since the letter arrived." 11 years. And you sat at that table with me for 11 years. "He asked me not to tell you." Mace's voice was level, not accusatory, not forgiving. Level the way a medic's voice goes level when the situation requires clarity more than it requires feeling. "I made him a promise. I kept it until keeping it became the same thing as letting that child sleep in a trailer park with a man named Del Rourke making phone calls in the dark." Colt looked at the letter again. "The winter of 2009, a warehouse south of Sparks. Cal Strent, the head of the Vipers, standing under a loading dock light with a duffel bag and a smile that had never once reached his eyes. $20,000 in exchange for what Strent had called highway access. A corridor through the stretch of two-lane that ran along the eastern edge of the Pyramid Lake Reservation. Colt had told himself it was gray money. He had told himself he was providing a service that cost no one anything. He had not asked what Strent's trucks were carrying. He had not asked what route they were taking once they left the corridor. He had not asked because he had known somewhere below the level of conscious thought that the answers would be expensive and the money was already in his hand. 3 weeks after that meeting on a December night in 2009, one of Strent's trucks had blown a tire on Route 446. The vehicle crossed the center line at 60 miles an hour and struck a pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. The driver of the pickup was a woman named Sarah Drummond, 34 years old, returning from a school basketball game in Sparks with her son Daniel, who was 12. Both of them died at the scene. The investigation opened and then quietly closed when the van involved disappeared from the impound lot and the witness who had stopped to help suddenly couldn't remember the plates. Colt had not known about the accident. Not in 2009, not for a long time after. But Eli Voss had known. Eli had found the second ledger in the floorboard safe of the clubhouse office in the spring of 2010, 3 months before he left. He had traced the money. He had found the corridor. And Eli's wife, Nora, who had worked as a paralegal before her lungs began failing, had found the newspaper article in the Pyramid Lake Tribal paper. A brief item about the accident on Route 446. 2 people dead. Investigation ongoing. She had connected the dates, the date of the deal, the date of the corridor, the date the van appeared and disappeared. She had put the pieces together with the methodical precision of someone trained to build cases from fragments, and what she had built was not an allegation. It was a record. Eli hadn't gone to the police. He hadn't come to Colt. He had packed a bag and driven away from everything he had built in the club and tried to make a life somewhere the weight of what he knew couldn't crush him entirely. He had written Mace a letter in 2013. He had written Colt a second letter and given it to Mace to hold. "There's a second letter," Mace said. He slid another envelope across the workbench. Thicker, sealed, Colt's name on the front in Eli's handwriting. "He told me to give you this one if you ever needed the full picture." Colt looked at the envelope. He didn't open it. Not yet. He slid it into his cut-inside pocket and felt it settle against his ribs. Eli Voss pressing against his chest from 11 years away. "Does anyone else know?" Colt asked. "Eli only told me," Mace said. And now you decide what to do with it." A door opened at the end of the hallway. Ivy appeared in the gap. Dark eyes, wrapped hand, hair pulled back in a ponytail that Birch had apparently helped her with that afternoon. The gesture so small and so complete, it was almost unbearable to think about. She looked at Colt, looked at Mace, read the room the way she read every room, measuring tension, the way a barometer measures pressure instinctively without needing to understand the science. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," Colt said. "The lie came easy. Lies always did when you had practiced them long enough to stop noticing the effort. Go back with your mom." Ivy didn't move. "You're lying. Your voice changes when you lie. The pitch drops at the end, like the words are too heavy to hold up." Colt stared at her. "I learned to listen," she said. "When my dad was sick, he would tell me everything was fine, and his voice would do the same thing yours just did." The hallway was silent. The oxygen concentrator hummed behind Nora's closed door. Somewhere in the common room, a clock marked the half hour. "Go back with your mom, Ivy. Please." She went. The door closed softly. Her footsteps moved across the floor on the other side and then were gone. Colt exhaled. It was the exhale of a man whose lungs had been holding something corrosive for a very long time and still weren't ready to release it properly. He looked at Mace. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll handle it tomorrow." Mace nodded once. He stood, picked up the vitals clipboard from the workbench where he had set it. When he sat down, tucked it under his arm, and walked back down the hallway without another word. The kind of man who delivers what needs delivering and then gets out of the way of what it does to the person who received it. Colt sat alone in the garage until the trouble light stopped swaying and the cold came up through the concrete floor and into the bones of his knees, and he finally stood because staying seated had become indistinguishable from hiding. The next morning came hard and bright, the Nevada sun doing nothing for the temperature, but insisting on itself anyway. Colt was in the common room when the county car pulled up the gravel drive. He watched it through the window and set down his coffee mug with the deliberate care of a man putting something down that he might not pick up in the same way again. Margaret Holm, the caseworker. Nora had mentioned her the night before during a brief lucid period when her oxygen had come up enough to make conversation possible. The county had an open child welfare file on Ivy. Holm had been to the trailer twice. The last visit she had told Nora that conditions needed to improve or placement proceedings would begin. And then Nora had coughed until she couldn't finish the sentence, and Ivy had rubbed her mother's back with practiced hands, and the conversation had ended the way most conversations ended in that trailer. Unfinished, filed away, survived. Mace Colt said without turning from the window. "Get Ivy out of the garage. Keep the door closed." He walked to the front door and opened it before Holm could knock. She was mid-40s, gray blazer, clipboard. The practical shoes of a woman who walked into difficult places and had decided long ago that whether people liked her arrival was not her primary concern. She looked up at Colt without flinching. The burn scars, the tattoos mapping his forearms, the patches on the cut he hadn't taken off since yesterday morning. He gave her credit for the steadiness. A lot of people managed about 1 second before their eyes found somewhere else to be. "Can I help you?" he said. "My name is Margaret Holm. I'm with Washoe County Child Protective Services. I have an open case file for Ivy Voss. Her previous residence at Desert Pines Trailer Park has been vacated, and a neighbor reported she was removed by a group of men on motorcycles. I need to verify her current situation and well-being. She's fine, she's here. I need to verify that myself. I need to. Colt stood in the doorframe for a moment. Behind him, he could hear Rex's boots in the hallway, heavy, deliberate, the sound of a man who had positioned himself close enough to know what was happening and was making no particular effort to hide that fact. "Give me a minute," Colt said. He closed the door. Rex was already there. His arms were folded across his chest, and his expression carried the compressed quality it got when he was doing the math on a situation and finding the numbers disagreeable. "Don't let her in," Rex said. "If I don't let her in, she comes back with a sheriff's deputy and a court order, and the entire calculation changes. She's here to take the kid. She's here to check a box on a form. There's a difference, and right now that difference is everything." Rex's jaw was set. The drooping left eye made his skepticism look structural, like it had been built into his face rather than placed there by circumstance. "You brought them here, Colt, into this house, without a vote." "There was no time for a vote. There is always time for a vote. That is the one thing in this charter that does not have exceptions." They looked at each other. The air between them had the specific quality of air that has absorbed too many difficult conversations in too small a space. This was not the first time they had stood in this hallway on opposite sides of a decision Colt had made without the table. But it was the first time the stakes had arrived in a county vehicle with a clipboard. "What would a vote have said?" Colt asked. "If I had woken everyone up at midnight in a frozen trailer park and said a dead brother's kid needs help and her mother is dying on the floor, what would the vote have said?" "That's not the point." "Then what is the point, Rex?" "The point is, the charter exists because one man's judgment, even good judgment, even right judgment, is not the same as the brotherhood deciding together. The point is that every time a president skips the table, it makes the table worth a little less. And we have been making the table worth a little less for a while now, and I am trying to tell you that I can feel the floor getting thin." Colt held his gaze. Something moved behind his eyes that he didn't let reach his face. "Call a vote tonight," he said. "Full table, everyone. And when we're done, I'll tell you something about Cal's strength that will change the way you understand why that county car is parked in our driveway." Rex's expression shifted. Not much. Just enough to register that a new piece of information had entered the room and that it was heavier than the conversation they had been having. "Tonight," he said. "Tonight." Colt turned and opened the front door again. He led Margaret home through the common room. She took it in with the systematic attention of a professional who has learned to build assessments from peripheral detail. The long table scarred with coffee rings and time. The cuts on the hooks by the door, each one a record of a life lived outside the lines she was paid to enforce. The kitchen where Dutch was washing dishes without looking up. The hallway with its buzzing overhead light. He brought her to the back room. Nora was sitting up. Mace had stacked pillows behind her and the oxygen was running clean, and her hair had been brushed by Ivy that morning, the way Ivy brushed it every morning, gentle and careful and thorough, as though competence were the only love language she had been given enough material to practice. Ivy sat beside her on the folding cot, feet dangling, hands in her lap, clean clothes borrowed slightly large. Her wrapped hand rested on her knee. She looked at home when the woman walked in, and her expression was the expression of a child who has learned to perform normalcy under observation and has had enough practice to be convincing. Home looked at her clipboard, looked at Nora. "Hello. Am I reading this right, Nora?" "That's right," Nora said. Home noted something. "How are you feeling today, better?" "The oxygen is regulated. I'm eating." Home looked at Ivy. "Hi, Ivy. Do you remember me?" Ivy nodded. "Can you tell me how you're doing?" "I'm fine. Are you attending school silence?" "The kind that is its own answer." Nora's hand found Ivy's knee beneath the blanket and applied the faintest possible pressure. "We're enrolling her next week," Colt said. "Sparks Elementary. I've already contacted the registrar." Home wrote something. The pen moved in small, controlled strokes, and the sound of it in the quiet room was like something being decided one letter at a time. "Mr. Harlan," she said, "I want to be direct with you. This environment, whatever the intentions behind it, is unconventional in ways my report is required to reflect. A medically fragile patient in an unlicensed care setting, a child with significant school absences, adults with no legal guardianship or custodial standing. She paused. The county has a responsibility to ensure Ivy's safety according to specific criteria: stable housing, medical compliance, educational enrollment, background checks on all adults in the household. She let the last phrase occupy the room on its own for a moment. Colt said nothing. He could feel Rex somewhere behind him in the hallway out of Holmes' sightline, and he could feel the specific quality of Rex's silence, which had density to it, the density of a man holding himself very still around something he might otherwise break. "I'll file my preliminary assessment by Friday," Holmes said. "That gives you 10 days before the formal review hearing. If conditions meet the criteria at that point, the case remains open but monitored." She looked at Ivy then. Something shifted behind the professional surface. Not softness exactly. The exhaustion of a woman who had sat in too many rooms like this one and already knew which way they tended to resolve. If the criteria aren't met, the county will move forward with placement proceedings. She left. The county car reversed down the gravel drive and disappeared behind the junipers. 10 days. Colt stood at the window and watched the dust settle and calculated what 10 days meant in practical terms. Enroll Ivy in school. Make the building pass an inspection that would include background checks on men whose collective legal history could fill a filing cabinet. Keep Nora alive and stable and improving by measurable criteria. Keep Strent's people away from the property and hold a full table vote tonight on a situation he had already committed the club to without asking. He didn't realize Ivy was beside him until she spoke. She said something quiet. He turned to look at her. "She's going to try to take me, isn't she?" Ivy said. "Not if I can help it. That's what people say when they mean probably." Colt looked at her for a long moment. The dark Eli Voss eyes, the jaw that didn't yield, the 9-year-old face carrying an understanding of the world that most adults spent their whole lives trying to avoid. "Yes," he said, "she's going to try." Ivy nodded, once. The nod of someone who has already run the scenario and is not surprised by the confirmation, only by the honesty. She went back to her mother's room. That night the table assembled, all 7. Boots on the worn wood floor, chairs scraping, the smell of coffee and the compressed feel of men who know a difficult conversation is coming and have each made their private peace with the fact that difficult conversations are the tax the Brotherhood levies on every decision that matters. Colt stood at the head of the table. "Before I asked for any vote, he said I owe you the full picture. And the full picture starts with 2009, with Cal Strent, and with something I've been carrying under this cut for 15 years without bringing it to this table." The room went the specific quiet of a room in which everyone has stopped pretending to do anything other than listen. He told them about the warehouse south of Sparks, the $20,000, the corridor through the reservation land. He told them he had not asked what Strent's trucks were carrying and had not asked because some part of him had already understood that the answer was expensive and the money was already in his hand. He told them about Sarah Drummond and her son Daniel, about Route 446 in December of 2009, about the investigation that opened and closed. He read their names aloud and held the silence after them for long enough to give the names room. He told them Eli had known, that Eli had found the second ledger and had left the club not because of Nora, or not only because of Nora, but because he could not sit at this table knowing what the money under the floor had cost and pretend the floor was solid. He told them about the letters. When he was done, he reached into his cut and placed the president's patch on the table in front of him and stepped back. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind, and it was not the loaded kind. It was something older. The silence of men who have just been handed a truth that rearranges the structure of everything they thought they understood about the ground they were standing on. Rex was staring at the table surface. His hands were flat in front of him. His neck was the red it always went when anger was building past the point where his usual architecture for it was sufficient. "People died," Rex said. His voice was very quiet. "Yes, Because of a deal you made and didn't bring to this table and didn't ask questions about? Yes. And Eli Voss knew that and left, and you let us think he left for a woman. I let you think what you concluded. I didn't correct it. Rex looked up, the drooping eye, the prison tattoos, the face of a man who had rebuilt himself on the principle that whatever else he had done inside these walls, he did not lie to his brothers. That's the same thing in Colt. In this room, silence is the same thing as a lie. Colt held his gaze, did not argue, did not qualify. The moment for arguments and qualifications was behind him. I know, he said. I'm telling you now because a child walked through a diner door 4 days ago, and she is the only reason I'm telling you now. And that fact is its own indictment. I know that. The vote took 14 minutes. It went 5-2. Colt kept the chair. Rex voted against. Dutch voted against. The rest, including Sloan, whose face during the confession had been carved from something harder than stone and more expensive than stone, voted to keep the president in place. Not out of forgiveness, out of the cold, tactical understanding that the threat outside this building was active and present, and that the worst possible moment to change leadership was the moment when an enemy was already in motion. When the gavel came down, Rex looked at Colt from across the table, and the look contained everything that the vote had not resolved. All of the things that would need to be addressed when the immediate threat was passed, if they survived the immediate threat. A reckoning that had been postponed, not avoided. I'm not writing for you, Rex said. I want that on the record. I'm writing for the kid. Colt nodded. That's enough. It was after the vote, when the brothers had dispersed to their corners of the building and the common room had gone to the particular silence that follows a difficult meeting, that Mace found Colt alone and handed him the second envelope. The one addressed to Colt, directly sealed, held for 11 years. Colt took it outside to the tree line at the edge of the property, where the junipers gave way to scrub, and the cold was horizontal and honest. He opened it standing up because some things you shouldn't sit down for. 2 pages, Eli's handwriting brown with age at the edges, an apology first, then a detailed account of finding the ledger and tracing the money, and the night Nora spread a newspaper article on their kitchen table and pointed at a date and said, "Look at this, Eli, just look at this." And then on the second page, the paragraph that stopped everything, Eli had written, "Nora has kept copies of everything. The ledger photographs, the corridor records, the newspaper clippings, the timeline she built. She made 2 sets. One is hidden in a place I won't name in this letter because letters can be found. The other she carries in a way that no one looking for it would think to look. If you are reading this, brother, it means the past found its way back. And if my girls are anywhere near this, when it does understand that the danger is not from landlords or poverty or failing lungs, the danger is from Strent. Because Strent knows that Nora knows. He has known since 2013, when someone talked who should not have. He has been watching her quietly ever since. He has been patient because she has been sick and stationary and unable to do anything with what she knows. But if she moves, if she surfaces, if the iron revenants come back into the picture in any way that draws his attention, he will not wait. Strent does not leave loose ends. And my daughter is the loosest end of all, because she is the child of the only man who ever looked at the ledger and walked away instead of staying silent. Get them out, Colt. Get them out before the corridor catches up. Colt stood at the tree line with the letter in his hands and the cold coming through his jacket, and Eli's handwriting pressing into his eyes with the specific mass of a truth that has been on its way for 15 years and has finally arrived at the address it was always heading for. He was back inside the clubhouse in 4 minutes. "Mace," he said, "we need to talk about Nora." Mace looked up from the hallway where he had been reviewing the vitals clipboard. The documents Eli mentioned. The copies Nora made. Where are they? Mace said nothing for a moment. Then you read the second letter. Where are they? Mace looked toward the closed door of the back room. When he looked back at Colt, his face had the expression of a man who has just understood that the thing he was waiting to be necessary has become necessary. I don't know exactly. I know she has them. Eli told me she would always have them close. He said she would know when to use them. Then we need to ask her. She's not strong enough for the conversation tonight. Colt looked at the door. Through the door in the quiet of the back room, Nora Voss was breathing oxygen through a borrowed machine, in a borrowed space, caring for years, something that could bring down a man who killed people to keep his secrets, and had done it alone and sick and invisible, and had done it specifically so that one day someone might be able to use it. Tonight he would let her rest. Tomorrow he would ask. But the timeline had already changed, because at 9:47 that evening, a phone call came in on the clubhouse landline that nobody had used in 6 months. Sloan answered it. Came to find Colt in the common room. Strent Sloan said, "He wants a meeting. Warehouse south of Sparks. Midnight tomorrow." Colt went still. The same warehouse, Sloan said. South of Sparks, the one off the old rail line. He said you'd know it. Colt stood by the window and looked out at the junipers in the dark. He did know it. He had known it for 15 years. Every detail of that building was preserved in the part of his memory that stores things a man wishes he could forget. He didn't hear Ivy come down the hallway. He didn't know she was behind him until she spoke. "That was the name, wasn't it?" she said. "The name Del Rourke said on the phone." He turned. She was standing in the hallway in a borrowed shirt that came to her knees and her father's absolute stubbornness worn on a 9-year-old face. She had heard. He did not know how much. "Enough. Go to bed, Ivy." She didn't move. "Is that why my dad left?" she asked. "Because of that name." Colt looked at her for a long moment in the dim hallway light. The concentrator humming behind Nora's door. The wind in the junipers outside. The enormous quiet of the Nevada desert pressing against the walls of the building, like a presence that has all the patience in the world. "Your dad left because he was the most honest man I ever knew," Colt said. "And I gave him a reason to be somewhere honesty was possible." Ivy held his gaze. Processing. Adding columns. "Are we safe here?" she asked. "Right now, yes." "What about tomorrow?" Colt crossed the hallway and crouched down to her level. His knees hit the floor. His burn scars disappeared into the collar shadow. "That's what tomorrow is for," he said. "We handle it tomorrow." She studied him. The same 3-second measurement, the same careful accounting. Then she did something he had not expected. She reached into the front pocket of the borrowed shirt and pulled out a small object worn smooth by handling the size of a child's fist. A carved wooden raven. He recognized the grain. Juniper. Sloane's pocket knife work left on the workbench without a note 2 days ago. She held it in both hands for a moment, then closed her fingers around it and went back to her mother's room. The door closed softly behind her. Colt stayed crouched on the floor of the hallway for a moment longer than necessary. The wind outside, the concentrator humming, the building holding its breath around a sleeping child and her dying mother and 7 men who were about to walk into a warehouse with 15 years of debt between them and a man who had never once in his life allowed a loose end to remain loose. He stood, rolled his neck, heard the vertebrae pop in sequence. He went to find Rex. The warehouse appeared out of the dark like a wound in the landscape. South of Sparks, past the last gas station and the last streetlight that pretended civilization still had jurisdiction out here. The building sat alone on a gravel lot bordered by dead railroad tracks and rusted chain link topped with razor wire that nobody had maintained in years. The corrugated walls had oxidized to the color of dried blood. The loading dock doors hung at angles, one open, one closed, one missing entirely, leaving a black rectangle that swallowed the headlight beams whole. Colt killed his engine 50 yards out. The others followed. The sudden silence hit like a wall. After 40 minutes of highway noise and wind and the deep primal vibration of 7 Harleys running in tight formation, the absence of sound was almost physical. His ears rang. His hands stayed on the handlebars, feeling the residual heat of the engine through his gloves, and he studied the warehouse, the way a man studies a room he is about to enter, knowing he might not leave it the same way he came in. 12 motorcycles were already parked along the loading dock. He recognized the builds before he could read the patches. Custom frames blacked out no chrome built for function over statement. The bikes of men who had stopped caring what their machines said about them and started caring only about what they could do. Rex pulled alongside him. 12, Rex said. His voice was the controlled monotone of a man who had moved past the fear threshold into the mechanical clarity that exists on the other side of it. We're 7. I can count, just making sure your judgment's been questionable lately. Colt swung his leg off the Road King and stood in the gravel. He rolled his neck, felt the vertebrae pop in the cold air. His body was a catalog of damage accumulated over 5 decades of hard use. The burn scars pulling tight across his shoulder in the cold. The chronic ache in his lower back that years of riding had ground into his spine like sand into stone. The titanium pin in his left wrist from a wreck 8 years back. He was 51 years old, and every year of it was present and accounted for in the architecture of his pain. He looked at his brothers. Diamond formation, he said. Rex and Mace with me inside. Sloan holds the door. Dutch and Riggs outside, engines warm. Anything goes sideways, you ride. You don't wait. You don't come back in. Riggs opened his mouth. That's not a request, Colt said. Riggs looked at Rex. Rex gave a single nod. The nod that meant follow the order now and argue about it later if there is a later. They walked toward the warehouse. Colt in front, Rex to his right, Mace to his left. Their boots hit the gravel in 3 different rhythms. Sloan positioned himself at the open loading dock door with his arms crossed and his bad leg bearing weight. Without complaint, his face arranged in the expression of a man who has decided that whatever happens in the next hour, he will be standing in this exact spot when it ends. Colt stepped inside. The warehouse interior was vast and cold and hollow. Concrete floor stained with decades of oil and chemical residue. Steel support columns rising into a ceiling lost in shadow. The only light came from a cluster of industrial work lamps arranged in a rough circle at the center of the space, their power cords running to a portable generator humming in the far corner. The lamps threw hard white light straight down, creating an arena of visibility surrounded by absolute dark. The visual equivalent of a stage designed so that the person standing in the center of it could see nothing outside the light, and everything inside it could be seen from anywhere in the room. Cal Strent stood in the center of that light. He was older than Colt remembered. 15 years older. Thinner through the face and shoulders, the muscle redistributed into something leaner and more angular. The body of a man who had spent a decade and a half managing rather than doing, calculating rather than hitting. His hair was gone, shaved clean, the skull beneath it marked with tattoos that climbed his neck and disappeared behind his ears. He wore a black leather jacket over a black thermal, no patches visible, nothing to identify affiliation. Smart, deniable. The wardrobe of a man who had learned that the most dangerous version of himself was the version no one could categorize. Behind him, 8 men stood in a loose semicircle. Not all of them wore viper cuts. Several were in plain clothing, hired weight faces that belonged to no club and owed loyalty to nothing but whatever was in the envelope they had been handed. Young, mid-20s to early 30s. Men who hadn't accumulated enough scar tissue yet to understand what it meant to walk into a warehouse at midnight with an audience. 2 more figures stood at the far wall, partially absorbed by shadow. Colt marked their positions without looking at them directly. 10 total in the room. His mind ran the geometry automatically the way it had been running geometry in dangerous spaces since before the road. Colt Harlan Strent said. His voice had been trained on the kind of conversations that happen in boardrooms and backrooms in equal measure. Smooth, modulated, carrying just enough warmth to make you forget momentarily what it was selling. Been a long time. Not long enough, Colt said. Strent gestured toward 2 folding chairs placed facing each other in the center of the light circle 3 feet apart. A gesture of civility that felt like the setup for something else. Sit down, we'll talk like men. I'll stand. Strent shrugged. He sat in one of the chairs himself, crossed his ankle over his knee, folded his hands in his lap. The posture of a man who believes he controls the room and wants you to notice how relaxed he is about it. You know why I'm here, Strent said. Tell me. A man named Del Rourke called a number he shouldn't have had, said an outlaw club was making problems for one of his tenants. Landlord dispute in a Carson City trailer park. Strent paused. Normally I don't pick up the phone for something like that, but the tenant's name was Voss. He let the name sit. That got my attention. Rourke's problem is settled, Colt said. It's handled. Rourke's problem was never the problem, and you know it. Strent uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands loosely clasped. The casual posture was gone. What replaced it was something that had been waiting behind the performance the whole time. Something that had survived 17 years by making certain calculations correctly and had made its peace with what those calculations sometimes required. Eli Voss is dead, Strent said. I've known that for 3 years. What I don't know is what he left behind. Letters, files, photographs of ledger pages, anything that connects my operation to a specific stretch of highway in the winter of 2009. There's nothing. You're lying. Strent studied him the way a camera studies a target. You moved the woman and the child out of Carson City in the middle of the night like the building was on fire. That's not charity. That's containment. You found something. Colt said nothing. Let me make this simple. Strent's voice dropped half a register. Whatever Eli left behind, I want it. You give it to me tonight, this ends. You keep your clubhouse. You keep your people. You keep whatever version of a clear conscience you've been maintaining. Everyone goes home. And if I don't have what you're looking for, then we have a problem, because I cannot afford to assume. The statute of limitations on what happened on Route 446 doesn't expire when federal land and civilian casualties are involved. I have built something real in the last 17 years. Legitimate business, real structure, real money. I am not going to watch it come apart because a dead man's daughter walked into a diner and set off a chain of events that leads back to a December night I have spent 15 years making sure nobody would ever look at twice. She's 9 years old, Colt said. I know exactly how old she is. The way Strent said it, flat and factual and stripped of the particular inflection that attaches to sentences about children, dropped the temperature in the warehouse by something that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Rex shifted his weight behind Colt's left shoulder, a barely perceptible movement. The recalibration of a man whose body has just moved from standby into something readier. Nobody touches that child, Colt said. I'm not threatening a child. Strent's voice was level. I'm not a monster. I'm practical. I have always been practical. That is why I'm still operating when every other crew from that era is either in federal prison or in the ground. Then be practical about this. I am being practical about this. 72 hours. You bring me what Eli left, all of it. After that, I start solving the problem the way I solve problems when the option of a reasonable conversation has been exhausted. Colt looked at him, at the pale green eyes that moved with the mechanical precision of something that had learned to mimic human expression without fully committing to it. At the hands loosely clasped between the knees, entirely still, the hands of a man who had not been personally afraid of anything in a very long time. You ran product through reservation land, Colt said. You know what I'm talking about. Route 446, December 2009. Van with a blown tire. A woman named Sarah Drummond and her 12-year-old son Daniel. Both of them dead on the scene. Investigation that opened and then quietly closed when the van disappeared. And the one witness who stopped to help suddenly couldn't recall the plates. The air in the warehouse changed. It didn't shift. It ruptured. The silence that followed was the silence of a sealed space suddenly exposed to something that had been building pressure outside it for a very long time. Everybody in the room recalibrated. Strent's men straightened. The two from the far wall moved forward half a step. Mace's breathing behind Colt's right shoulder went into the pattern Colt recognized from road emergencies, slower, deeper. The controlled respiration of a man preparing his body for impact. Strent's face went through a single transformation. Not dramatic, just a shift behind the eyes, the way a lens adjusts focus. The smooth businessman was gone. What replaced it was the thing that had made him capable of running a criminal operation for 17 years in a landscape where most men who tried lasted 5. That was an accident, Strent said. An accident on a corridor you paid me to keep open. A tire blew. Wrong place, wrong time. And the van disappeared and the investigation died, and a 12-year-old boy's name never made the papers because someone made a phone call. Colt's voice didn't rise, didn't harden, just continued at the same controlled register, steady and inexorable, the voice of a man who has decided that this particular truth is going to be spoken in this particular room regardless of the cost. And someone else answered it. Strent stood. The chair scraped on concrete. His men moved with him, a synchronized shift that compressed the semicircle into something tighter, a coil that had decided it was done, waiting to see whether it needed to release. You took the 20,000 Colt. Strent's voice had found a new register, still controlled, but stripped of the veneer. You didn't ask where it came from, and you didn't ask where the trucks were going, and you fixed your roof and paid your lawyers and sat at the head of your table for 15 years with my money under your foundation. So don't stand in this warehouse and perform outrage about blood on hands. I'm not performing anything, Colt said. I'm telling you what I know and what will happen with it if anything happens to that woman, if anything happens to that child, if anyone with your patch or on your payroll comes within a mile of my clubhouse or my people or any hospital that Nora Voss walks into. Strent looked at him. Every document Eli left behind goes to the Washoe County DA, to the tribal police at Pyramid Lake, and to a federal prosecutor I have already been in contact with. The silence that followed was different from the previous one, denser. The silence of a man running calculations he doesn't like the outcome of. You're bluffing. Try me. If you send those documents, you go down with me. Conspiracy. Accessory. You took the money and you kept the corridor clean. You're in the same cell block as me. I know. And your brothers. Every man who benefited from what that money paid for. They go down too. I know that too. You'd burn yourself. Strent's voice had shed another layer. This one had something underneath it that was not quite disbelief. Something closer to the specific bafflement of a man who has spent his entire career dealing with people who have a price and has just encountered someone who has done the accounting and arrived at a different kind of answer. You'd burn your brothers for a dead man's family. Colt looked at him with the storm-gray eyes that Ivy had learned to read. The Nevada sky that hadn't decided yet, except that it had decided. It had decided 4 days ago in a diner when a 9-year-old girl placed a water-stained photograph on a table and recited her dead father's words from memory and stopped shaking for the first time because someone had wrapped a jacket around her shoulders. In a heartbeat, Colt said. Strent's jaw worked. The muscles along his temples flexed and released. He looked at Rex, measured the road captain's size, his stillness, the readiness radiating from him like heat from an engine block that has been running hard. He looked at Mace, smaller, quieter, but carrying the focused intensity of a man who had kept his hands steady while people died around him and had not looked away once. 72 hours, Strent said finally. Bring me what Eli left. All of it. And if you decide not to wait 72 hours, Colt said, the conversation we just had is already documented. Strent turned and walked toward the far end of the warehouse. His men followed in sequence, peeling away from the semicircle, the way a wave retreats from a shore, still dangerous, still deliberate, but moving in a different direction. The two from the wall were last walking backward for the first 10 steps, watching the revenants with the professional attention of men paid to gather information about what they were walking away from. The generator kept humming after they were gone. The work lamps kept burning. Colt stood in the center of the light circle and let the silence of the empty warehouse settle around him. He's not going to wait 72 hours, Mace said. No, he's going to move tonight, tomorrow at the latest. The meeting was to assess what we have and how we're positioned. Now, he knows we're serious about the documents, and he knows we've moved Nora out of Carson City, and he's going to calculate that the longer he waits, the more entrenched our position becomes. Colt turned. Rex was already moving toward the door. "We ride back fast," Rex said, "and we called Dutch before we hit the highway." They rode back in a formation tighter than the one going out. The highway was empty midweek, and past midnight the desert stretching black and infinite on either side. The only lights were their own headlights and the occasional distant glow of a ranch window, small and isolated, against the enormous dark. Colt rode at the front and felt the letters against his chest and the cost of what he'd said in that warehouse settling into his bones alongside everything else he carried. And somewhere beneath it all, he felt something that was not quite clarity, but was adjacent to it. The sensation of a man who has been waiting for a reckoning to arrive and has finally stopped spending energy on the waiting. He called Dutch from the highway, one hand on the bar, the phone pressed to his ear against the wind. "Dutch, how's it look?" "Quiet so far. Nobody on the drive. Sloan's got the building secured. Strent's not going to wait," Colt said. "He's going to split his people. Some come here, some go for the van. You need to get Nora and Ivy out of the building tonight." "Tonight?" Dutch's voice compressed. "Where do we take them?" Colt had been building this part of the plan since he read Eli's second letter at the tree line. Eli had written about Nora's sister, a woman named Wren who lived in Elko, 4 hours east. No connection to the club, no address in any database Strent was likely to have access to. Nora and Eli had not spoken to Wren in years, a family rupture that had happened in the aftermath of Eli's death and had never healed because grief rarely distributes evenly and sometimes it breaks the wrong things. But she was blood. And blood in Colt's experience had a way of answering the phone when the call came in at the worst possible hour. "I need you to wake up," Nora, Colt said. "Tell her it's time to call her sister. She'll know what that means. Have everything packed and the van running when we get back." "Done." "And Dutch, the van takes the back road out, not the highway entrance. There's a service road on the north side of the property that runs through the scrubland and comes out on Route 445 about 2 miles east. Use that." "Got it." Colt ended the call and pushed the Road King harder. The needle climbed. The wind became a pressure against his chest, and the cold in it bit through every layer he was wearing, and the tires ate the highway with the urgency of something that has identified what it needs to reach. They pulled into the clubhouse drive at 2:14 in the morning. The building was lit. He was off the bike before the engine finished settling and through the front door in 6 steps. Sloan met him in the hallway. "We've got movement on the road camera," Sloan said. "Black pickup, no plates, doing slow passes on the highway out front. Already been by twice in the last 20 minutes. Strent's people. Has to be. And Colt. There's something else." Sloan's voice had the deliberate flatness he used when he was delivering information that he had already processed past his own initial reaction and was now presenting purely as data because the data needed to be heard clearly. "I checked on the girl 20 minutes ago. She wasn't in the back room." Colt went still. "She's in here," Sloan said quickly. "She's in the common room. She's fine. But she was up and she had clearly been listening from somewhere she shouldn't have been." Colt walked to the common room doorway. Ivy was sitting at the long table in the dim light. She had a glass of water in front of her that she wasn't drinking. She was wearing the borrowed shirt and the expression of a child who has gathered more information than adults intended her to have and is currently deciding what to do with it. She looked up when Colt came in. "You need to wake up my mom," she said. "She needs to call Aunt Wren." Colt looked at her. "How do you know about Wren?" Ivy held his gaze steadily. "Because 2 nights ago my mom woke me up when she thought I was asleep and she told me. She gave me an address and she told me that if something happened and the men who were supposed to help us couldn't, I needed to find my Aunt Wren in Elko. She said she had already arranged it. She said Wren was waiting." She paused. "She also told me something else. She told me to tell it only to Mace. She said only Mace, Ivy, do you understand, only Mace." Colt turned his head. Mace was standing in the hallway behind him. Mace stepped into the room. He crouched down to Ivy's level. His eyes were reading her the way they read every patient, cataloging, assessing, looking for the thing beneath the presenting condition. "What did she tell you to tell me?" Mace asked. "There is a box," Ivy said, "in the yard behind Aunt Wren's house. Third fence post from the left, buried about a foot down. There's a combination lock. The combination is my birthday. My dad's handwriting is on the inside of the lid. And inside the box, there is a USB drive. My mom said it has everything on it. She said you would know what that means." Mace looked up at Colt. Colt looked at the 9-year-old girl sitting at the table in the dim light of the common room with a glass of water she hadn't touched, and her dead father's stubbornness, and her sick mother's foresight distributed evenly across her small face. Nora had known. She had known for years that this night might come. She had known that being sick and stationary and invisible had a limit. She had prepared for the moment the limit was reached. Not with hope, with methodology, with the precise and patient work of a woman who had been a paralegal before her lungs started losing the argument, who understood how evidence was built and preserved and delivered, who had decided that if she couldn't protect her daughter with her body, she would protect her with documentation and a buried box, and a sister 4 hours east who had been told to keep the porch light on. Eli Voss had married the right woman. Colt said, "Go wake your mom, Ivy. Tell her it's time." Ivy slid off the chair and walked down the hallway without running. The door to the back room opened and closed. Mace stood. The look on his face was the particular expression of a man who has spent 11 years carrying a promise and has just watched the reason for the promise walk down a hallway in a borrowed shirt. "The van leaves in 30 minutes, Colt said. Dutch drives. You ride in the back with Nora." Ivy sits up front. "What about the pickup on the road? They're watching the front." Dutch takes the service road north. By the time Strent's people figure out the building is empty of the people they're looking for, the van is 2 hours east, and there's nothing here worth finding. "And us. We stay. We hold." Colt looked at him. "If Strent moves on this building tonight, he finds 7 men with nothing to trade and nothing to threaten. We're not the objective. Nora and Ivy are the objective. Without them here, we're just a motorcycle club in a cinder block building, and burning that down costs him more exposure than it's worth." Mace nodded slowly. "And the documents, the real ones, the USB. If Ivy makes it to Elko and the box is there, we have something real. Actual records, photographs of the ledger, Nora's timeline, years of careful preparation by a woman who was sick and broke and alone and still managed to build a case that would make a federal prosecutor sit up straight." Mace moved toward the back room to prepare Nora for transport. Colt went to find Rex. Rex was at the window of the common room watching the highway through a gap in the curtain. The black pickup had made another pass. Its headlights moved across the juniper tree line at the end of the drive without turning in. "Strent's testing the perimeter," Rex said. "He wants to know if we're spooked enough to run." "Are we?" "We're sending the people he's looking for out a back road in the dark," Rex said. "That's not running. That's a different thing. It's the same action. It's a different intention." Rex let the curtain fall. He turned from the window. In the dim light of the common room, his face was older than it had been a week ago. The prison tattoos, the drooping eye, the big hands at his sides. The face of a man who had voted against his president 2 nights ago and come to work this morning anyway, because the vote and the work were separate questions. "I've been thinking about what you said in the warehouse." "What part?" "The part where you said in a heartbeat." Rex looked at him. "I've been trying to remember the last time I heard someone say something like that and mean it. Not as a performance, not as a negotiating position, just as a statement of fact about what they were willing to lose for something they believed in." Colt said nothing. "I still think you lied to this table for 15 years, and I still think that is a debt that doesn't get cleared by one good decision." Rex's voice was level, not angry. The anger had been processed somewhere between the vote and midnight, and what was left was something more durable. "But I also think that Eli Voss knew who he was trusting when he wrote those letters. He didn't write them to a stranger. He wrote them to the man he believed would eventually do what needed doing when the moment required it. even if it took 15 years and a 9-year-old girl walking through a diner door to get there. Rex picked his cut off the hook by the door and put it on. "I'm not riding for you," he said. "I just want to be clear about that." "You've been clear." "Good." Rex pulled on his gloves. "Now let's make sure that van gets out clean." They moved the van at 3:40 in the morning. Waking Nora was the work of minutes, but they were not easy minutes. She came back to consciousness slowly, the way she always did when the oxygen had been doing most of the work. And her first word was Ivy's name, and her second word was Ivy's name again. And the third time, Ivy appeared in the doorway of the back room and said, "Mom, I'm right here. I'm right here. I'm fine. It's time." And Nora's breathing changed into something that was still labored, but was no longer desperate. Mace walked her through the plan in the precise and unhurried voice he used for patients who needed information more than they needed comfort. Elko, Ren, 4 hours, the box in the yard. Nora listened with her eyes closed and her hands folded on top of the blanket. And when Mace finished, she said, "I packed that box in 2015. I haven't told anyone where it is except Ivy." "I know," Mace said. She looked up at him. "He told you," she said. "In the letter." Yes, she considered this. The concentrator hummed. Outside, Dutch had the van running at the edge of the service road, headlights off. "Tell Colt," Nora said. "Tell him that Eli didn't blame him. He says it in the letter somewhere in there. Tell Colt he says it because Eli knew that Colt would carry the blame regardless, and he wanted it on record that he didn't." Mace looked at her for a moment. "I'll tell him." Rex carried Nora to the van. Ivy walked ahead and held the van door open, and when Rex settled Nora onto the blankets in the back, Ivy climbed in beside her without being asked her hand, finding her mother's wrist in the dark and resting there, just resting the way she had done in the trailer on the floor, the way she had probably done 1,000 times in the years when it was just the two of them against everything. Before the door closed, Ivy looked at Colt. He was standing at the edge of the service road, backlit by the single working security light at the corner of the building, his shadow stretching long across the gravel and the dead brush. His burn scars were invisible in the dark. He looked like what he was, a man standing at the edge of something, watching something valuable move away from him into the dark, having done what he could do to protect it, and not yet knowing whether it was enough. Ivy held his gaze from inside the van. "On the Raven," she said. "You promised." "On the Raven," Colt said. The door closed. Dutch eased the vehicle forward onto the service road, without lights moving slowly through the scrubland. The tires quiet on the hard-packed earth, the van disappearing into the dark between the junipers and the highway, with the steady, unhurried progress of something that has committed to its direction. Colt stood and watched until the van was gone. Then he reached into his inside pocket and closed his hand around the carved wooden Raven. The wood was warm. He held it there against his ribs for a moment in the cold, dark Nevada morning, feeling the grain under his thumb, the wings Sloan had shaped with a pocket knife, on an afternoon that felt like a different world entirely. Then he went inside and did what had to be done. Strent's people arrived at 4:22. 3 men on foot coming through the chain-link gap on the east side that had been broken since 2019 and that Colt had decided 2 hours ago to leave broken. He watched them on the road camera monitor that Sloan had repaired specifically for tonight. He went to the door and opened it before they got to the front step. The man in front stopped. Mid-20s, canvas work jacket, the particular set to his jaw of someone who has been told he is here to deliver a message and has not yet developed enough experience to understand the difference between delivering a message and being the message. "You're at the wrong address," Colt said. The man said Strent wants confirmation that the woman and the child are still here. "They're not here." Silence. "We're going to need to verify that." Colt held the door open wider. "Come in," he said. "Look around. They're not here, and there's nothing here that belongs to Strent or that Strent has a claim on. You can verify that personally, and then you can call him and tell him the Iron Revenants have 7 men in a cinder block building and nothing he wants and nothing he can use. And if he sends anyone to this address again for any reason, the documents Eli Voss left behind are going to a federal prosecutor whose number I already have in my phone. The man in the canvas jacket looked past Colt into the common room. He saw Rex sitting at the head of the long table with his arms folded and the expression of a man who had done 4 years in a state facility and found every subsequent threat in his life somewhat anticlimactic by comparison. He saw Sloan against the far wall with a stillness that had nothing meditative about it. He saw Birch in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee and the patient look of a man waiting for something to require his attention. The man made a phone call. He turned partly away and spoke quietly. Colt caught fragments. Nothing here. Van is gone. 7 men. Then something Strent said on the other end of the line took the prepared set out of the man's posture the way air leaves a punctured tire. Gradual. Definitive. He pocketed his phone. He looked at Colt one more time. Then he turned and walked back toward the chain-link gap, the 2 men behind him following without a word, boots crunching on gravel in the dark. Colt stood in the doorway and watched them go. Then he went to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the long table across from Rex. Rex said, "Was that it?" Colt said. "That was the first part." Rex considered this, the drooping eye, the big hands wrapped around his own mug. The second part comes when Strent decides whether the exposure cost of pressing further is less than the exposure cost of the documents going public, Rex said. Yes. And you think he'll decide it isn't? I think Strent has been running calculations like that his entire career, and the answer is almost always the same. A man who has built something real, as he called it, has more to lose than a man who has nothing left to protect. We have nothing he can threaten anymore. Nora is 4 hours east in a vehicle he can't track. The documents exist, and he knows they exist, and he knows we've already been in contact with legal counsel. The cost of pressing forward is federal exposure and the loss of everything he spent 17 years building. The cost of backing off is accepting a standoff. Strent's a practical man, Rex said. He told us that himself. They sat in the silence of the early morning with the coffee growing cold and the desert dark outside the windows and the junipers barely visible against a sky that was beginning very slowly to suggest the possibility of dawn. Colt's phone rang at 6:47. Mace's voice. Tight, careful road noise in the background. "We're at Wren's. Nora's inside. Ivy's inside. Wren was on the porch when we pulled up. She had the light on." Colt exhaled. "The box," he said. "Ivy went straight to the fence," Mace said. "Third post. Combination worked. Colt, the USB has everything. Nora's timeline. Photographs of the ledger pages. Copies of the corridor agreement. A written account with dates and corroborating sources. Nora built a complete case, not circumstantial, documentary. This is what a paralegal does when she has 11 years and nothing left to lose except her daughter." Colt held the phone and felt the carved raven in his inside pocket against his ribs, the wood still warm from where he'd been holding it. "How is she?" he asked. "Nora Ivy." A pause. The sound of road wind and a house waking up around a family being reassembled from pieces that had been separated too long. "She's sitting at a kitchen table," Mace said, "with her aunt, with her mother, eating scrambled eggs. Wren is crying. Nora is crying. Ivy is not crying. She is eating her eggs, and she asked me to tell you something." "What?" "She said you still owe her a shovel head." Colt looked at the table in front of him. The scarred wood. The coffee ring from the mug he had set down a week ago and 100 years ago when 7 men sat in a booth at the back of a diner and the bell above the door rang and a small wet girl walked in out of the Nevada winter and changed the coordinates of everything. "Tell her I know," he said. "Tell her I'll bring it myself." The weeks that followed were not cinematic. There was no single moment when the threat resolved itself cleanly. No confrontation with a definitive outcome. No scene in which justice arrived on schedule. What happened instead was the slow and unglamorous work of accountability finding its level. Marion Cross, a criminal defense attorney in Sacramento, who had represented outlaw clubs for 30 years and whose reputation was built on the principle that she never bluffed, filed the sealed documentation with a federal district court. The filing was coordinated with the USB records Nora had prepared, authenticated, and transmitted with the kind of meticulous chain of custody that made prosecutors sit forward in their chairs. A copy of the filing summary was delivered to Strent's attorney, not to Strent himself, which was worse because lawyers understand the specific weight of sealed federal documentation in ways that their clients sometimes have to be educated about. Strent's operation went quiet within 3 weeks. Not dramatically, not with a declaration. With the gradual, invisible retreat of an organization that has recalculated its exposure and decided that the cost of continuing outweighs the benefit. The blacked-out custom bikes stopped appearing at the truck stop off the interstate. Strent's name stopped moving through the networks Colt monitored. The corridor east of Pyramid Lake went silent. The Route 446 accident remained unresolved in the formal legal sense. Colt knew it would for a long time, possibly forever. The system moved slowly, and the people who had made the investigation disappear in 2009 had distributed themselves into positions that made accountability complicated. But the tribal police at Pyramid Lake had opened a new inquiry with the documentation Nora had provided. And Sarah Drummond and her son Daniel had names now spoken in a federal filing attached to a record that could not be unfiled. Colt had memorized their names on the night he read Mace's letter in the garage. He carried them the way he carried his burn scars, permanently, as part of the cost of being exactly who he had been. Margaret Holmes' review hearing came 9 days after the night of the warehouse. Colt brought every piece of documentation he had assembled. Ivy's school enrollment confirmation from Sparks Elementary, where she had started classes 4 days earlier, and had reportedly informed her third-grade teacher on the first morning that the engine in the school's riding lawnmower had a failing carburetor. Nora's updated medical care plan, signed by a pulmonary specialist in Sacramento, that Marion Cross had arranged through her network with a detailed recovery timeline, and a notation that the patient's prognosis had improved significantly with access to appropriate care. Background check waivers and character references for the 7 men of the Iron Revenants, assembled by Birch, with the systematic thoroughness of a former teacher who understood that paperwork was its own kind of argument. Holmes sat across the table from Colt in the county office and read through the file for 11 minutes without speaking. When she looked up, her expression had not changed significantly from the one she had worn in the clubhouse doorway. But something behind it had shifted. The exhaustion was still there. The expectation that rooms like this one tended to resolve a particular way. But something else, too. The expression of a woman who has been wrong about a specific case before and has the integrity to recognize when she might be wrong again. The case remains open and monitored, she said, but I am not recommending placement proceedings at this time. She closed the file. And Mr. Harlan. She looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite approval and was not quite its opposite. Whatever this is, whatever you people are to each other, make sure it continues to be what it is right now. Because right now, it is the only thing standing between that child and a system that would do its best for her and still fall short. Colt nodded. It will be, he said. He drove back to the clubhouse in the early afternoon with the Nevada sun doing the thing it does in winter, hitting the desert at a low angle that turned the scrubland gold and made the mountains look like they were lit from the inside. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in. The junipers along the drive stood in their crooked rows, stripped to the essential by decades of desert wind, rooted so deep that nothing had ever pulled them out. He reached into his inside pocket and took out the carved wooden raven. Sloane's juniper work. He turned it in his hands. The grain had darkened where Ivy's palm had rested against it every day for the week she had carried it. He put it back, against his ribs, where Eli's letters had been. Then he went inside to call Mace and tell him that Ivy and Nora could come home. 6 weeks later, Nora Voss had surgery in Sacramento. A pulmonary specialist named Dr. Ainsworth performed a 6-hour procedure to remove the damaged tissue from her left lung and reconstruct the bronchial architecture that had been collapsing incrementally for 2 years. The surgery was funded collectively by the club, drawn from individual savings, contributed without ceremony or accounting, the way men contribute to something when they have agreed without discussion that it is the right expenditure of whatever they have. The iron revenants waited in the hospital lobby, all 7 of them. Colt stood outside at the entrance and smoked and paced and did not pretend to be doing anything else. Rex sat in a plastic chair that was comically undersized for his frame and stared at the floor between his boots with the focused intensity of a man attempting to will a specific outcome into existence through sustained concentration. Mace sat with his hands flat on his knees, the medic's stillness, the body at rest, but the mind running its own triage on the hours ahead. Birch and Sloane sat together and did not talk and were precisely as present as they needed to be. Dutch and Riggs occupied a corner of the waiting area and watched the door. Ivy sat between Rex and Sloane. She did not pace. She did not fidget. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the surgery unit doors, and the stillness in her was not the stillness of a child, but the stillness of someone who has spent their entire life learning to wait for news that could go either way, and has decided that stillness is a form of respect for the outcome, whatever it turns out to be. When Dr. Ainsworth came through the doors at 4:17 in the afternoon, still in scrubs, mask pulled down to his chin, the lobby went quiet before he said a word. "She's going to make it," he said. "Recovery will take months. Her lung function won't return to full capacity, but she is going to make it." The exhale that moved through the room was collective and simultaneous, and had no sound that a language has a word for. The release of something 7 men and 1 girl had been holding in various degrees for 6 weeks. Ivy stood. She walked across the lobby to where Colt was just coming back through the entrance door, still pulling off his jacket from the cold outside, not yet knowing. She walked up to him and wrapped both arms around his waist and pressed her face against his sternum, and her shoulders moved once, twice, and then were still. Colt put one hand on her head. His palm covered most of her skull. His fingers were scarred and calloused and permanently marked with engine grease that no soap had ever fully removed. He stood very still because he understood that what was holding on to him was not just a girl, but the idea that the world contained people who showed up and did not leave. And that idea in a 9-year-old who had spent her life collecting evidence against it was more fragile than any engine he had ever been trusted to repair. "You didn't tell me anything," Ivy said into his shirt. "I told you I'd be here in the morning. It's afternoon." "Close enough." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then she stepped back and looked up at him with her father's eyes and her mother's precision and her own particular version of both. The version that was only hers, assembled from everything she had survived and everyone she had loved. In the long winter walk across 40 miles of Nevada, dark, guided by nothing but a dead man's faith. Behind them, Rex was standing with his arms at his sides and his head turned away from the room and doing something with his face that he would deny for the rest of his life, and that every man present would corroborate the denial of, because some dignities are more important than accuracy. The years that followed were not dramatic. They were something better than dramatic. They were real. Ivy grew up in the particular way that children grow up when they are surrounded by people who show up. Not without difficulty, not without the complications that come from 7 damaged men and 1 resilient girl, and a mother recovering slowly in a world that had never made recovery easy, but showing up consistently in the specific and unglamorous way that constitutes the actual texture of family. She learned to rebuild engines completely, not just diagnose them, not just assist. She learned from Birch the patient way her father had never had the chance to teach her the correct sequence, the torque specifications, the particular sound a properly seated valve makes when the engine turns over for the first time after a full rebuild. When Ivy was 14, there was a morning in the garage that nobody talked about afterward, but that every man who witnessed it remembered. She had been working on a complete rebuild of the same 1978 shovelhead she had first examined 5 years earlier, the one with the leaking pushrod tube seal that had been her first real conversation in this building. She had been at it for 3 weeks, mostly alone in the hours before and after school, her notes spread across the workbench in handwriting that looked like Eli's. On that morning, she set the last component, checked the connections one final time, and kicked the engine over. It fired on the first try. The sound filled the garage, low and clean and honest. The particular note of a machine that has been put back together correctly, every part in its right place, every tolerance met. Birch was standing in the doorway. He had been watching for the last 20 minutes. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets and let the engine run and let the sound of it be exactly what it was, which was a 14-year-old girl who had been given a broken thing and had made it whole. That was enough, more than enough. She learned from Sloan how to read road conditions in the behavior of other drivers. From Rex, how to change a tire in the dark in under 4 minutes. From Mace, the names and properties of every medication her mother took, and the early warning signs of the pulmonary complications that continued to require monitoring for years. She went to school. She was not an easy student in the ways that schools prefer their students to be easy. She asked too many precise questions. She had no patience for approximations. But she was also, underneath all of it, a child who had spent too long in survival mode and needed years of ordinary safety before that mode fully disengaged, and the people around her gave her those years without making a project of it. Nora recovered. Not completely, not to the capacity she had before the illness compounded over years of inadequate care. But enough. Enough to sit at a table and laugh. Enough to walk across a room without the concentrator. Enough to be present for the years she had been afraid she would not see. She and Ren rebuilt their relationship the way estranged sisters sometimes do not, with a single conversation that resolves everything, but with 100 small ones that accumulate into something that functions like closeness. Phone calls, shared meals when geography allowed. The slow return of an ease that had been there before grief made it impossible, and was still, it turned out, findable beneath the years of distance. In the spring of the year Ivy turned 22, she walked across a stage at the University of Nevada and received a degree in mechanical engineering with a specialization in motorcycle powertrain design. Her thesis examined optimization of airflow dynamics in vintage V-twin engines. The acknowledgments page listed 7 names that no one in the academic review committee recognized, and that she had written with the deliberate care of someone who understands the difference between a name on a page and a name that has been earned. The ceremony was held on a Saturday afternoon in May. The Nevada sun was doing what it does in spring, hitting the high desert at the angle that turns everything to gold and makes the mountains look like they are burning from within. In the third row, Nora sat in a blue dress she had bought 2 weeks earlier, her breathing steady, her lungs scarred but functional, her eyes bright and warm in a way they had not been in the trailer at Desert Pines. Ren sat beside her. Their hands were not quite touching on the armrest between them, which was its own kind of progress. In the front row, 7 men sat in a line. They were older. The leather cuts were faded, the patches softened by years of sun and road and Nevada weather that takes everything seriously. Colt's burn scars had been joined by the ordinary accumulations of age, the arthritis in both hands, the stiffness in his lower back that made mornings their own particular negotiation. Rex had gone gray at the temples. His bad eye drooped more than it used to, and his hands, which had once bent metal, shook slightly in the cold mornings, in a way he denied and everyone else silently accommodated. Mace still carried a book in his cut. A different one. Same pocket. Birch had the particular stillness of a man who had made his peace with something and found it lighter than he expected. Sloan sat with his bad legs stretched in front of him and watched the stage with an expression that contained more than it showed as usual. They sat in their folding chairs in the front row and watched Eli Voss's daughter walk across a stage in a cap and gown, and the distance between what they were and where they were was so large it should have been uncomfortable. It was not. Because the people around them in that auditorium, the families and faculty and university officials, could see something that the leather and the scars and the tattoos couldn't obscure. That these men belonged to the woman on that stage the way roots belong to a tree. Invisibly. Essentially. Without requiring explanation or apology. Ivy took the diploma, shook the dean's hand, turned toward the audience, found them immediately. The seven faces, the storm gray eyes, the drooping left eye, the medic's steady gaze, the mechanic's hands folded in applause. She stepped to the microphone. "My father taught me that blood makes relatives," she said. Her voice carried with the clarity of someone who had practiced being brave so many times it had become simply who she was. "But loyalty makes family." The room stood. Afterward, in the parking lot where the Nevada evening was doing what Nevada evenings do in May, turning from gold to rose to a deep purple that settles over the desert like something earned. Ivy walked to the row of Harleys parked along the campus drive. 7 bikes older now, maintained with the care of men who understand that machines, like the relationships they carry through the world, last longer when someone pays consistent and unglamorous attention. She ran her hand along the tank of Colt's Road King, the same bike, the same chrome she had gripped with both hands, including the bruised one. Pain be damned on a frozen Nevada night, 13 years ago, when a child pressed her face against the leather between a stranger's shoulder blades and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember that the shaking had stopped. Colt stood beside her, older, slower, carrying more than he had in that parking lot all those years ago, and still standing because the junipers along the clubhouse drive had taught him something about what deep roots mean when the wind comes. "You kept your promise," Ivy said. He looked at her. "Which one, all of them?" She reached into the pocket of her graduation gown and took out the carved wooden raven. 13 years of being carried. The juniper grained dark with the oils from 1,000 moments when a girl had wrapped her fingers around it and held on because holding on was the only option available. And she had decided in the particular way that some children decide things that become permanent, that she would not stop holding on. She placed it in Colt's palm. He looked at it. His thumb moved along the carved wings the feather Sloan had shaped with a pocket knife on a cold afternoon in a clubhouse that smelled like motor oil and coffee and the quiet, stubborn refusal of men who had no better option than endurance. "I don't need it anymore," Ivy said. Colt closed his hand around the raven. The wood was warm from her pocket. From 13 years of being carried by a girl who had needed something to hold and had found it in the rough and imperfect kindness of men the world had written off before it understood what they were capable of. He put it in his inside pocket, against his ribs, in the place where Eli Voss's letters had once pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. The cost of a truth carried too long in the wrong direction. The wood settled there now with a different weight. Not lighter, not heavier. The weight of something that had been carried through the dark and had arrived at the place it was always meant to be. Around them, the Harleys fired in sequence. 7 engines. The sound rolled out across the campus parking lot and dissolved into the Nevada evening, low and deep and familiar as breathing. The evening air carried it away toward the mountains, where the last light was doing what light does in the high desert, when the day is finished spinning itself completely against the sky with the extravagant generosity of something that knows it will come back tomorrow. They rode out slow, no formation, no particular order. Just 7 motorcycles and 7 men in the open road going wherever the road went, in the understanding shared without being spoken. Because some things only need to be spoken. Once that somewhere behind them, Eli Voss's daughter was standing in a parking lot with a diploma in her hand and a future in front of her that existed because a room full of broken men had decided on a frozen night 13 years ago in a diner outside Reno that some debts don't have a dollar amount and some promises don't have a time limit. They just have the road and the next mile and the mile after that. And somewhere in the dark beyond the mountains, the memory of Eli Voss rode easy. Not because the world had become fair, not because the scars had healed or the dead had come back or the mistakes had been unmade, but because his brothers had kept riding and his girls were safe, and that had always been enough.